The Kingdom of Kandy is or was in the interior of Ceylon, in the highlands of what was called Ceylon in the 19th century. It was a very independent, fiercely independent kingdom that resisted the intrusion of first the Portuguese and then also the Dutch before falling to the British finally in 1815. So one of the things that historians have been very interested in recent years is this question of the relationship between knowledge and colonialism. It comes partly out of the influential work of Edward Said, who wrote his book Orientalism. More recently, the questions that historians have been asking are, well, how do we locate indigenous knowledge and indigenous resistance as a form of knowledge against colonial knowledge? What I want to do is to really locate the types of knowledges that the Kandians had and utilized in strategic terms against the British. And this might be a knowledge of terrain, it might be a knowledge of how to cope with disease, it might be military knowledge, a whole range of different types of knowledges which the Kandians utilized against the British quite successfully in this early phase of colonization. In a sense, we think about European colonization as bringing about modernity. So we think about modernity as something that rolls out from Europe, and that includes identity, it includes science, technology, state formation, a whole range of things which constitute modernity, which come from Europe with the spread of colonization. But what we have from this case is quite a different story, I would suggest, where we have indigenous structures and polities developing forms of knowledge, developing forms of organization and even identity, which are strangely parallel to those sorts of processes that we find in Europe. And so what we have is a coming together of these systems. By suggesting this sort of phrase, coming together, I don't mean that there isn't any violence associated with it, because in fact there are kind of very violent clashes between different knowledge systems, and there is resistance on the indigenous side. But at the same time, some knowledge is inherited by the British and utilized strategically as well. So it's a complex story of collaboration and resistance, continuity and discontinuity as well. Something I'm very excited about is working with a unique set of sources which historians haven't really utilized properly before, namely the palm leaf manuscripts of Sri Lanka. Now, palm leaves are found quite widely in South and Southeast Asia, and they can be courtly manuscripts, or they could be manuscripts from rural peripheries kept by village elders and so on. They are made out of palm leaves, and you can hopefully see an image of one of these now, and they usually take the form of ballads. So they're recited at, say, courtly ceremonies or at village functions. And what's very special about them is that they provide access into the knowledge systems of local people. So there's lots of stuff on medicine, on natural history, on topography, on retellings of the past, ideas of history, for instance, as well, which one can take away from these palm leaf manuscripts. So by using these palm leaf manuscripts, we can come to what might be termed indigenous knowledge, or the knowledge that indigenous peoples had anyway. I suppose one could see it as secret information. It's definitely a form of information that doesn't translate straightforwardly into colonial knowledge. There are various ways in which actually the type of knowledge base that the British had built unwittingly on indigenous knowledge. So for instance, one of the things I'm interested in is the role of natural history. And here something very striking happened. So botanical gardens were very important for agronomy, for colonial projects of improvement in the early 19th century, centers for the collection of information. And one of the main botanical gardens in the British Empire was the Peradeniya Botanical Gardens outside Kandy. But something which I discovered after my research was that rather bizarrely or tellingly, this botanical garden was in fact established on the site of an existent botanical garden, which was one of the gardens founded by the kings of Kandy. So what we have here is the Kandian Information Order, which is natural historical, which is connected to the palm leaves, which is connected to other institutions as well, feeding into the British project of colonial knowledge. So it's not only that the knowledge is secret, but that actually it is inherited by the British, though sometimes those inheritances have been lost in the historical narrative, so that we actually think about the British coming with their Enlightenment knowledge, which is quite different to local knowledge, and conquering the terrain because of the knowledge that they have. But actually, sometimes the foundations of that colonial knowledge are in fact indigenous, and so that indigenous knowledge does pass into British knowledge, even sometimes though it's kind of protected by indigenous peoples and used strategically against the colonists as well. Well, I think in a sense, when we think about Europe and what it knew against what the rest of the world knew, we're still very much imprisoned by the ways of thinking that are colonial, which we've inherited, which is basically this sort of rhetoric of colonization, where colonizers thought that they had superior knowledge. But in fact, in real terms, that knowledge was based on what they learnt in the field, in the colonial territories themselves. In relation to the story of colonialism and knowledge, it's very important to realize that this is an account about the expansion, the early expansion of the British Empire. So this narrative of the entanglement of knowledges encompasses a particular historical moment, which quickly passes, because what happens by the 1840s, by the 1850s, is that the British become supreme, and their supremacy extends to knowledge as well, and to the ready exporting of English knowledge, British knowledge, into colonial territories. And so, though I'm sure that there still are in the record accounts of indigenous knowledge passing into colonial knowledge, these become effaced with the kind of supremacy of colonial knowledge established more firmly.